Okay, we're gonna start. Um, as I'm sure you all know, this is Krueger, and Ruben just said that I should say he needs no introduction.
Well, thanks for that very nice introduction. When Ruben invited me to this conference, I told him that I've been doing a little bit of work on intergenerational mobility, and in particular, Larry Katz and I were writing a comment on a paper by Raj Chetty and several co-authors that I'd be happy to talk about our comment. And Ruben asked me if I could send him a copy of Chetty's paper. He read Chetty's paper. He said, "This is really clever, interesting work. Why don't you present that?" And I should also highlight that Chetty has several co-authors, 3 sociologists and 3 economists wrote this paper, so it's perfectly balanced. What I'm going to do in the next 35 minutes is describe Chetty's paper. Hopefully you're familiar with it. It was published in Science last week. And then I'll discuss the comment that Larry Katz and I wrote on the paper and throw in some other observations. The paper has a really simple idea, very appealing idea. The idea is to measure income mobility by absolute income mobility, meaning the fraction of people who earn more than their parents did at a similar age. And if you have micro data, this is very easy to calculate. You can just look at income of children, kids, YK, in a particular cohort and see if their income is at least as great as their parents' income. Indicator function there. And then you calculate the fraction who are earning more than their parents. Now, this is difficult to operationalize because you would need longitudinal data over a very long period of time. And Chetty et al. Use a very clever approach where they can use aggregate distributional data. And they have to make some assumptions. I don't think the assumptions are driving their main conclusions, and I'll show you why that's the case. And to just tell you what their main conclusion is that in the US there's been a significant drop in the rate of absolute mobility. So if you look at children born in 1940, over 90% of them earned more than their parents did when you observe both of them around age 30 in terms of real income. Their estimate was 92% of children born in 1940 were earning more than their parents did when they were in their early 30s. Then if you look at the cohort born 1984, that figure fell to 50%. So only about half of Americans in the most recent cohorts are earning at least as much income as their parents did in their early 30s. Now, how did they reach that conclusion? Well, they take advantage of a variety of data sets. They estimate the marginal distributions of income of parents and children using data from the current population survey and the census. And they estimate the joint distribution of parent and children ranks, known as the copula, using data from tax records. They estimate that at for just one cohort of children, those born in the early 1980s. They assume that it's stable. That's a big assumption. They have evidence that it's stable going back to the cohort born 1971 from a paper that a subset of the authors published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And then they do a very interesting robustness check to see if this assumption is so critical to their results, which I'll show you. So just to be more concrete about their method, they calculate the marginal income distribution of children. This is really the inverse distribution. So QKC is the income cutoff for rank, RK. Likewise for parents, QPC is the income cutoff at rank of parents. And then the joint distribution of children and parents' ranks is given by C of RK or P. And then I think this ought to be a double integral. You integrate over both the children and the parents' ranks, and look at if what's the fraction of cells where the children are earning more income than their parents. I should also mention that they deflate by the consumer price index. There have been some questions about whether the CPI overstates the rate of inflation in the US, so they do a whole bunch of robustness checks on that. And they're looking at pre-tax family income around age 30. There are lots of problems getting the parents' income distributions because they need to go to different censuses and look at parents who had children who were born in a particular birth year and then find those parents when they were in their early 30s. They're actually looking at parents between an interval of 25 to 35. There's a little bit of slippage. I won't go into too much detail on that. The distribution of ranks, they do this non-parametrically. They just look at 100 by 100 cell transition matrix. And I mentioned earlier taking it from the early 1980s, estimated using IRS data. Now, the nice thing about their method is they don't need individual data. You could do this in the aggregate. So the tax authorities could give you the information, they could post it online, and anyone can calculate these statistics. I mentioned earlier that they assume stability of the copula, which is a key assumption in what they're doing. But later on, I'll show you the bounds that they put on that. So their baseline estimates, let's consider children born in the 1940 birth cohort, and then look at the fraction who earned more than the parents did 30 years later, 1970, and you can look at that by percentile. So the horizontal axis here is the percentile of the parental income distribution, and the vertical axis tells you the percentage of children from those groups who are earning more than their parents did. And it has this really interesting pattern where at the lower percentiles, children were extremely likely to earn more than their parents. At the very high percentiles, they're unlikely to earn more than their parents. Rockefeller's children, although they had high income, earned less than Rockefeller. That's one of the issues with absolute income mobility. It kind of throws away the fact that the children of very wealthy parents had high income, although it was lower income than their parents. So this shows you the 1940 cohort and the whole distribution. This shows you the 1950 cohort. We're looking at their income in 1980, and you can see it has shifted down. The 1960 birth cohort, 1970 birth cohort, which isn't too different than 1960. And there's an interesting reason for that, which they don't go into their paper. But the 1970 birth cohort was 30 in 2000. And in the late 1990s, in 2000, the US economy was very strong. Inequality actually fell in that period. It's one of the few periods where we've seen inequality decline in the US over the last 45 years. And I think that played a role there. And then this is the most recent cohort, 1980 birth cohort. So you can see that you have this downward sloping pattern in terms of the odds of earning higher income than one's parents now. This shows you the average for each birth cohort. When I say the average, it's the fraction of people in each birth cohort who earn more income than their parents did when observed in their early 30s. And this is what I mentioned earlier. If you look at the 1940 cohort, it was 92% were earning a higher income than their parents, and that's now down to 50%. And it really fell considerably up until the cohort born around 1965, and then it's drifted down a little bit since then, but it's been fairly stable since then. And they interpret this as the fading American dream. The American dream is that one's children would do better than one's parents, and that's much less likely now than it was after World War II. They also look regionally, and interestingly, if you look at the Midwest, like Ohio and Michigan, there used to be higher absolute income mobility in the industrial Midwest than in New York and Massachusetts, and now that's reversed. There's been a steeper decline in absolute mobility in the Rust Belt states. I think they make a little bit too much out of this because you could connect this to the fact that the Rust Belt states, supported President Obama and then supported President Trump in the last election. But if you look at some other states like Nevada, you see the same thing. You saw a bigger drop in absolute mobility in Nevada or New Hampshire, which are states that actually became more blue over time, more supportive of Democratic candidate. But there's obviously been a lot of discussion connecting the decline in income mobility in the U.S. with polarization in our politics, and this picture is kind of suggestive of that, although I think it's a somewhat selective picture. Okay, so how much confidence should we place in these results, given that they're assuming that the distribution of ranks is constant over time? Well, they do a really interesting exercise, and maybe this is why the paper required 6 authors. They relax the assumption that the copula is stable back to 1940 by considering all possible joint distributions and then creating a bound, upper bound, lower bound, in terms of absolute mobility. And it's not entirely all possible. They have one restriction, which is first order dominance, which is that children of high income parents tend to do better than children of low income parents. So they impose that constraint when they do their linear programming problem to solve for all of the possible bounds. And this is what it looks like, where the dashed line on the bottom is the lower bound and the dashed line on the top is the upper bound in terms of absolute mobility generated by the range of feasible copulas. And the important thing to take away here is if you look at 1940, the bound is really tight. The lower bound is like 82, 83%. So even if you used sort of the worst case scenario in terms of the joint distribution between parents and children's income that could have existed in 1940, we still would have had a rather dramatic decline in absolute income mobility. And there's and notice also the bounds are getting wider over time. There's an intuition for why that's the case. The bounds are pretty narrow when you look at the 1940 cohort because the blue shows you the income distribution of parents in the 1940 cohort, and it lies pretty much to the left of the income distribution for children. The 80th percentile parent from the 1940 birth cohort was earning less than 76% of children. So right there, that tells you you're going to have a great deal of absolute income mobility. And then if you look at the 1980 birth cohort, you see a spreading out of both distributions. And in addition, the distribution of children the mean didn't increase very much. So the 80th percentile of parents now lies above only 74% of children. So the bounds are going to be much wider. But this is of less concern because we actually know what the transition matrix looks like for this cohort. So additional sensitivity analysis, they used alternative price deflators. They subtracted 0.5 percentage point, 0.8 percentage point from the CPI. They looked at post-tax and transfer incomes. They looked at incomes at age 40 instead of at age 30. They use individual income instead of family income, and I think this makes sense, particularly for looking at sons and fathers. I wanted to show you that. You see an even steeper decline if you look at sons versus fathers' individual income. That's the red line, an even steeper decline. So sons currently are only about 40% of young men have a higher income than their parents did when they were in the early 30s. The last thing I'm going to discuss from their paper is a set of counterfactuals that they do. Why is it that we've seen absolute mobility decline so much? And they look at 2 obvious candidates. One is a slowdown in economic growth, and the other is spreading out of the income distribution. To give you the punchline, they both matter, but the spreading out of the income distribution matters much more. And the intuition is that growth, the benefits of growth are highly skewed to the very top. Most of the upward mobility comes from the bottom. So the fact that the bottom hasn't been seeing gains means that growth is not so important for generating gains, but the rise in inequality is very important. So that's the bottom line. How did they get there? They kind of imposed 2 different counterfactual scenarios, and these are not additive. These are done separately. First is higher growth. They say, let's suppose that we grew at 2.5% since 1940 instead of 1.5%. And alternatively, they say, let's suppose that we grew at, well, we actually grew at 1.5%, but let's suppose that the distribution of GDP is the same today as it was back in 1940, or for the 1940 cohort. So this just shows you what I showed you earlier on. These are the actual absolute mobility rates by percentile for the 1980 cohort in the bottom and the 1940 cohort in the top, and the average was 50% versus 92%. If they assume faster growth rate, growth of 2.5%, but the actual distribution that we have for the 1980 birth cohort, the average would have been 62% of children earn more than their parents as opposed to 50%. So that accounts for maybe 30% of the difference that we see in mean absolute mobility. And if they impose the other counterfactual, which is we have the actual growth rates that we've observed, 1.5%, but we distribute the income the same way that it was distributed for the 1940 cohort, absolute income mobility would be 80%. So about 3/4 of the decline is due to the change in the distribution of income, roughly 1/4 due to slower growth is the way I interpret these figures. And that's actually quite shocking, because I think the way that the fading American dream is often discussed is we just need faster growth. We just need to get back to the growth rates that we had before the 1970s, and that'll cure all of our problems. And it turns out that'll help. I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Okay, so that was their conclusions. So the comment that Larry Katz and I wrote also was published last week. One of the things we observed is, instead of doing all of the work they did, which was a lot of work, if we just calculated the difference between the median income of parents in one cohort and the median income of children, you account for virtually all of the variability in absolute mobility. Or another way to put that, the blue line here is Chetty et al.'s estimate of absolute income mobility, which fell from 92%, that's on the left scale, to 50%, that's on the right scale. And the red line is the difference in median income, real median income, between parents and children from those cohorts. You'll notice they're parallel lines. The correlation coefficient is 0.995, which for me was a personal record in terms of generating correlation coefficients. Although in a moment I'll tell you we actually broke that record. Basically, the decline in real median income in the US is a sufficient statistic for understanding why absolute income mobility has declined. And I think there are lots of advantages of looking at real median income instead of going through all of the effort of calculating the absolute income mobility that Chetty et al. Do in their science paper. First of all, it's an easy thing to include on your dashboard for how an economy is performing. You can also convert differences in median income to absolute mobility, numerically. We find $10,000 decrease in real median income for children relative to their parents is associated with 9 percentage point decline in absolute mobility. And there's a good intuition for why this matters, because real median income reflects both the growth in income and the distribution of income. Since most of the income is going to the upper tail, the mean doesn't reflect what's going on in terms of most people, but the median does. This also requires that the copula is stable, although that doesn't seem to be so critical for the results. So my guess is that that's not. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's another advantage of this. When I first reviewed Chetty et al.'s paper, I was puzzled by the fact that absolute income mobility began to fall for the 1945 cohort. And the reason I say that is income inequality rose in the US beginning in the early 80s. And what they find is that if you look at the 1945 cohort, which turned 30 in 1975, that's when we saw absolute income mobility begin to fall. Well, that's when real income, particularly median income, began to stagnate. Inequality started to rise later. So I think it helps to resolve that puzzle in the results. Larry Katz and I went a bit further when we looked at some other measures. So one could argue, well, maybe it's hard to calculate real median income for the parents cohort and the children's cohort, but you could calculate in any given cohort what fraction of people are earning more than not their own parent, but then the median parent from their cohort. So an alternative measure, and this is one that gave us a correlation of 0.998, which broke my record of 0.995, was just to look at the share of children in any particular cohort who are earning more than the median parent from their cohort earned in real terms. And that has an even stronger correlation with the decline in absolute mobility. And again, that's really easy to calculate because you don't need longitudinal data. You don't need to make assumptions about the copula. You just calculate what fraction of people are below this threshold and how is that changing. This is also beneficial for analysis because when I read through the Chetty et al. Paper, I was very interested in looking at subgroups, particularly African Americans, where there have been big changes in opportunity in the U.S. after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, after the end of de jure segregation in the U.S., and they're not able to identify racial groups using the tax data, but one could do that with census and household survey data. In other countries, you can look at other groups. So I thought this was another advantage of these measures. Now, this rests on the assumption that the copula is relatively stable, and we suggest doing additional research by looking across states over time, where you could look cross-sectionally or look at the trends and see if the strong correlations that we're finding when we use the difference in real median income between parents and children, that holds up on a regional basis as well. So I would argue that focusing on real median income also helps to understand the causes of the decline in absolute mobility. And there's a big literature on why real median income has stagnated or declined in the US. Part of it involves human capital. So one class of explanations, which I'll start with, involve human capital. There's been a slowdown in the US in educational attainment of children compared to their parents. Not a decline, but a slowdown in the growth. So Golden and Katz calculated that children born in the early 1940s had 2 more years of schooling than their parents did. And children born in the 1980s had 3/4 of a year more education than their parents did. So the decline is 1 1/4 year, which could account for, say, 15% less income using conventional rates of return to education. And then, of course, there could also be general equilibrium effects because of a slowdown in human capital accumulation. Also, there's been a slowdown in our measures of school quality, like pupils per teacher or the length of the school year, which I think has also probably led to relative slowdown in human capital accumulation. And I also want to emphasize, because I think it's very important, given Chetty et al.'s findings, if you look at the whole distribution, the slowdown has been particularly prominent at the bottom of the distribution for lower income parents. So this chart, which I've taken from a paper by Martha Bailey and Sue Dinarski, shows the fraction of students in 2 different cohorts who complete college. The dashed blue line is my cohort, 1961 to 64 birth years, and the red is 79 to 82. And you can see that college attendance and college completion in the US has increased, but it's being driven by the top half, children born from families in the top half of the income distribution. There's been hardly any change in the bottom half. So that's going to contribute to the slowdown in absolute mobility, because the group that's most likely to out-earn their parents are those who are in the bottom half of the income distribution. And their rate of accumulation of human capital has slowed. And I think this is related to the Great Gatsby curve. With Miles Korak in the audience, I thought I would highlight the Great Gatsby curve. You know, the idea that inequality in one generation leads to slower income mobility, more persistence of income across generations. We find that across countries, we find that across regions within the US. And given the rise in cross-sectional inequality in the US, the Gatsby curve, if we take this as a causal relationship, is suggesting that we're going to see further persistence in income across generations in the US. And there's another set of explanations for the slowdown in the growth in real median income in the US. I don't think it's all due to human capital. Labor demand shifts seem to be weighing against the less skilled, middle skilled workers. We've also had a fissuring of the US workforce with jobs being outsourced, particularly lower wage jobs, which has been putting downward pressure on low wage work. Less rent sharing within organizations because low wage jobs have been outsourced to contract firms who have lower profitability and share less rent with their workers. Decline in labor unions. Richard Freeman has a recent paper where he finds that communities that have higher union density have greater upward income mobility. Another factor which I'm doing work on is the growing use of non-compete clauses and restrictions on competition in the US labor market. 20% of American workers have currently signed agreements or covered by clauses that they can't work for a competitor if they were to leave their company. Even companies like McDonald's have restrictions that their workers can't go and work for another McDonald's, which is I think helping them to monopolize the US labor market. And we've had declining geographic mobility in the US, and there's a lot of work suggesting that geographic mobility, particularly from contracting areas to growing areas, has been a source of economic mobility. We concluded our paper by discussing classes of interventions, and I think it's important to document the problem, and it's important to try to do research on the interventions that can help. So we highlight 5 classes of interventions. Maybe this isn't the best way of thinking about this, but this is the way we thought about it. First is a set of policies to raise productivity growth. And even though the slowdown in economic growth is not the whole story, it's part of the story. And raising economic growth, I think, would have lots of benefits, particularly if we can combine that with policies which would lead to more inclusive distribution of the benefits of growth. So here we highlight research and development and capital investment, policies to raise human capital, particularly for children from the bottom half of the income distribution. The obvious suspects here are universal preschool, improvement in school teachers, better retention of better teachers, greater access to public universities, especially for children from lower income families, job training, etc. Policies to raise wages and employment of low income households. The obvious candidates here are the minimum wage, collective bargaining, antitrust action to try to prevent non-competitive behavior by employers, tax subsidies to encourage more employment of low employment groups. And here I wanted to highlight something. This shows labor force participation of prime working age men in the original OECD countries as well as Israel. And this is a topic I've been doing work on because if you look at the US, men used to be on the relatively high end of the OECD in terms of labor force participation. But there's been a steady decline in labor force participation of prime age men in the US. And now the US is at the bottom of the OECD. I used to say second to Italy, but we're third to Italy and Israel. Um, 88% of men aged 25 to 54 are currently in the labor force in the U.S., employed or unemployed. And this trend, this downward trend, has been occurring since the 1950s. So it's a trend that's taken place for quite some time. Part of it is due to a drop in demand for less skilled men. The downward trend is more prominent for less skilled men, which again is a problem when it comes to absolute income mobility. Work I've been doing recently suggests that the opioid crisis in the U.S. is intersecting with this problem. Half of the men who are out of the labor force in the U.S. are taking pain medication on a daily basis. Now, I just wanted to highlight Israel, and maybe others understand these statistics much better than I do. I presume that the low participation rate of the ultra-Orthodox is an important factor driving this trend. There's been a slight uptick for Israel in recent years, which might be due to changes in cultural practices or in improvement in the economy. But Israel is still very much on the low end when it comes to male labor force participation for prime working age men. If you look at women, the story is different for both Israel and the U.S. and more encouraging for Israel. Israel's the dark blue line, which is kind of in the middle of the OECD. U.S. used to have very high labor force participation rates for women. They peaked around 2000 and have started to decline. And it's much more difficult to understand why labor force participation is declining for women than men, because it's a fairly ubiquitous phenomenon. It's occurring for women with children, women without children, married women and single women, well-educated or poorly educated women. So this is one of the reasons why I highlighted factors to increase employment, bring people back to the labor force. I focused on pre-tax and transfer income, but obviously tax and transfer policy can have an effect, and can have an effect both on labor force participation and on after-tax income. And a very important policy that we have in the U.S. in this regard is the Earned Income Tax Credit. Then lastly, the class of interventions that I wanted to highlight are those that are focused on particular places. In the U.S., poverty is highly geographically concentrated. How do we address pockets of poverty and low upward mobility? And the Obama administration had something called the Hardest Hit Fund, designed to try to help areas that were hardest hit by the recession. And I think thinking more in terms of geography, mobility policy, like moving to opportunity, are classes of interventions that might be helpful to increase upward mobility. So let me conclude by saying, at least for the U.S., I think that raising absolute income mobility is going to be a challenge because of the Great Gatsby curve, because of the fact that high inequality tends to reduce mobility, and also because of the trends we're facing with labor force participation. You'll notice that most of the items on my list are not a high priority of the current U.S. President or Congress. I had this as a paragraph in the conclusion of the Science article, but they cut it out. It is nonetheless important for researchers to document the impact of the changing income distribution on societal well-being and economic opportunity. And I think it's imperative that we continue to do research on the types of interventions that are likely to be efficacious in terms of raising living standards and enhancing upward mobility. Such research is essential if countries are going to provide opportunity for all of their citizens. And in the U.S., eventually we'll come back to more rational government policy, so it'll be useful to have that available. And my daughter told me I should always have a thank you slide at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
To present the equivalent for their countries. So we would like them, let's start with another competitor in terms of income distribution, the UK.
course, now I've seen Alan's presentation in the flesh, I've got millions more ideas of things that I could do, but this is how far we got. Okay, so it's now the Krueger statistic, Alan. So there we are, it's got a name, the Krueger statistic. So the data that I had to hand to look at this question, I'll just tell you what we found and then I'll offer a few remarks on what I think it means. The data that we had to hand to look at this question of what proportion of children earned more than the generation of parents at the same age was some cohort data that I'm going to use in my presentation, which is the 1970 cohort data. So we're going to observe those people at 34 in age 2004. It seemed like quite nice to just focus on a very specific cohort as we had that data. Now, it would be nice to compare the Krueger statistic with some information on real absolute mobility. I haven't done that yet, partly because there's a bit of trouble with the income data and how it was recorded, and that's why we've never done this before in the UK. Because you look at the parental income data and you look at the kids' income data, they completely change the questions for the kids, and you just think, I don't really buy it. So this is quite a nice way for us to get around that. So we look at the parents, they're not the real parents, in something called the General Household Survey, which offers data back to 1972 and provides information on earnings from employment and earnings from self-employment. It also provides information on income, and that was something I was challenged with, family income that is. But the problem is the information that's given in the cohorts on family income is a bit patchy. So you get into, you're not really convinced again, because it's essential that it's measuring the same thing. So you're not really convinced that it's doing that. So I actually have to focus on sons and their fathers here, which is not ideal, but it's okay. So the headline that we do from this comparison is that 83% of sons in this cohort have higher incomes than the median of their father's generation. And spent a little bit of time waiting for Steve Machin to get back to me on whether he thought this was plausible from other data. And it turns out that it looks like it is fairly plausible. Both the figures for median income that we're getting for both the father's and the child's generation from a different source. Now, this is obviously quite strong mobility compared to the information that Alan gave us on the US. So in the US, I think for 1970, it's about 60%, I think. So it looks like the UK is doing quite well at this particular point compared to the US. And one thing that I thought was kind of nice, so it's still not very pretty resolution. Tried to get someone to send me a better graph, hasn't quite worked. But this is some information that Dave Blanchflower and Steve Machin put together for the Centre for the Economic Performance magazine, which is why it looks kind of nice. And the blue line is the UK median income of full-time weekly wages, and the black line is the US. So given that Alan's drawn our attention partly, although not entirely, to growth of median income over this time, you can really see that the UK was performing much better over this period. So in that case, it's not really a surprise that the UK seems to be delivering more in terms of absolute mobility. However, I think that what's also quite clear here is that there's been a marked downturn recently in the blue line, which indicates that potentially that's not true. Now, as I was listening to Alan, I was jotting down three kind of potential causes of changes in absolute mobility, one of which is growth, and one of which is inequality, which we're partly picking up here because we're looking at the median, of course, and the other one of which is changes in relative mobility. So it's quite striking that they assume in the States that this copula is constant, whereas, as we'll see later on when I speak, the UK, the evidence is that this copula is not really constant. So you have to wonder what the difference in the UK will be when we manage to do this over time, whether we would find actually something driven by that as well, or maybe not. So another thing that I thought would be quite interesting to do was just to look a little bit at the regional variation, partly because I haven't managed to do the change over time yet. And one thing that's kind of noticeable here is that I wouldn't say this is a huge amount of variation over areas. I couldn't quite see what it was in Chetty or remember it anyway. But one thing you do notice here is that London is kind of at the top of this. and we'll pick up on some of those on that issue later on. But it's quite interesting that it does shine through, and that Scotland and is poorer, and the East Midlands. I don't really know why that would be. So we did do a little bit of checks on this, so we can make sure that the median incomes are comparable. One thing that's kind of interesting is I wanted to use the General Household Survey to pin down the father's distribution of income, partly because we know who the fathers are. So we can actually identify the men who had sons in exactly this cohort, born between 68 and 72. Okay? If we looked at administrative data, we wouldn't be able to do that. But it's interesting that actually the figures are kind of similar if we just use administrative data. So it may be that if we want to do changes over time, we can get more out of that.
So I'm pleased to follow Alan's presentation of someone else's paper with a presentation of someone else's paper. And in particular, I'm going to highlight some of the findings from a recent Statistics Canada study, which was directly motivated by the science paper that Raj and his colleagues produced. You would think that we would be able to do something very similar with at least information from the Canadian census, which goes back, but there are also some challenges in which the way in which income is collected. And if you can believe it, in some of the previous census says income wasn't even collected. So the difference that this study that Yuri Ostrovsky of Statistics Canada did was it involved a direct linkage between parents and children through the income tax files, and therefore just sort of covering the more recent birth cohorts. The paper was published just last week as well, or the week before. So he's looking at selected birth cohorts between 1970 and 84, and I'll let you read through the description of the paper. The bottom line is that while Chetty and his colleagues are describing a continued decline in these cohorts born between 70 and 80, or probably a leveling off, that's the case in Canada as well. There's little change, but I also want to introduce some caveats towards the end and some response to the kinds of policies that how Alan highlighted and how they play out in Canada. So here's a picture. There's a dark blue and a light blue set of bars. They're just being sensitive to whether you are adjusting for family income or not. There's some question about this because the parents are sort of all married, coupled, and partnered, but the kids not necessarily so. So you can see, if we just look at the dark bars and look at adjusted family income, that in 1970, just under 60% of children earned more than their parents. That rises a little bit, but basically pretty constant. So a little bit below the American results, and then a little bit above. So at least for this short period of time, you don't see much action. I want to also underscore a comment that Alan made about basically measurement error and what's going on. So if you look at median incomes in Canada, you can easily go back to the mid-1970s and compare them with median incomes now, 2014, 2015. They're basically flat. Median income, household income is about 53,000. But what you're missing in that is a very sharp V-shaped pattern. From about 1980 on, median incomes dropped very sharply after the 81-82 recession, then again in the early 1990s, where we have a self-inflicted recession to fight in inflation. And they hit a low in the mid-1990s. And then they shoot up quite tremendously a continual growth as the Canadian economy rides the coattails of the Clinton boom, as the high-tech bubble comes but doesn't really burst as sharply in Canada as in the US. And then this amazing commodity price boom that carries the Canadian economy almost through the Great Recession without as much damage as it did elsewhere. So potash and oil prices did amazing things to the demand for labor for low-skilled workers, and go figure, the price just went up for those workers. So there was very strong growth. So part of what's going on here, I think, could be to do sort of with temporary fluctuations in the labor market, and it remains to be seen what happens next. The other difference in the countries we might want to highlight, and just to go through Alan's list of 5 policies, with respect to growth, there are real concerns in Canada as in elsewhere about promoting growth. It's still a bit of a mystery of how to give productivity growth its kick. But we do much better, I think, in terms of human capital development, particularly as we're going into this era of higher inequality, as the next generation is being raised in an era of higher inequality, with better preschool, higher quality primary education, and access to high quality universities that's not at all constricted in the same way in the US by financial considerations. All of the provincial governments have seen significant increases in minimum wages. The Ontario government just increased the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which will be phased in, and that's indexed to inflation, for example. Collective bargaining has certainly taken a hit in Canada, particularly in the private sector, but not to the same extent in the US. In terms of tax and transfer policies, what's really important is not to let inequality in the lower half of the income distribution get out of hand, and children who live in poverty in Canada don't live in the same absolute level of poverty as they do in the United States. Where we don't do so well is probably in terms of geographic mobility. So it's sort of a wait and see to actually see what happens with absolute mobility in Canada because of these measurement error issues, I think. But at least the policy infrastructure seems to be aligned in the way that Alan imagines it should go.
Now, I'm in the extremely embarrassing position to be the third speaker, and I'm supposed to. I was asked by Ruben to provide these numbers, and I optimistically claimed that I could provide them for 2 different countries. But I'm going to stand here and confess that I provided them for 0 countries. I was trying up to the finishing line to actually get some numbers at all, but didn't. So I will instead say a few things as a comment to Alan's presentation, and I think more generally possibly about mobility and inequality research. And I will be brief, but I think these are interesting questions. Now, one of the, I think a first thing to ask, and this is a question that possibly only makes sense to an economist thinking in coming from the kind of social choice way of thinking about the world, but it's the following thing, which I've devoted a lot of attention to in recent years following my work with Stephen Jenkins. And is mobility a good thing? In fact, is mobility something to which we should assign any social value whatsoever? By the fact that we're all here and many of us have spent considerable time thinking about this, it seems obvious the answer is yes. But coming from public economics, it's actually not. And it turns out there are a few ways in which mobility can have social value, but it's not obvious that they're the ways in which we think about it primarily. One is that if you take a dynastic view of the world, then you have then it's a multi-period problem, and the work by Atkinson and Bourguignon on multiple period utilities play a role. But it's not obvious that we in fact take a dynastic view of the world, that we assign welfare to dynasties of persons. Rather, it's the person who's the natural unit of our social welfare analysis. And even then, if you take the dynastic view, it's not immediately obvious that the mobility is valued. You could plausibly argue that immobility should be valued instead. Very few people think that, but all the same, it's a possible view to take. The more promising way to think about assigning social value to mobility is to take a reference-dependent point of view of individual well-being and think that our well-being depends not only on our current level of welfare but on our expectations of what that welfare should be. And then a natural way to think about the reference point is to think of the reference point as being childhood living conditions. But again, that may lead to quite not obvious ways of thinking of utility. It gets you back into the old problem that if you take a utilitarian point of view, it might well be that the person who expects to have champagne and caviar every day but fails to achieve this is the person who's doing less well. And then from a utilitarian perspective, you'd increase utility by assigning more resources to those persons rather than to the ones who are living on very meager resources if in a sense they're very effective at generating utility. So this may get you into some kind of unpleasant territory unless you think very carefully about it. But on the other hand, it's reasonably obvious to me that people do in fact think of mobility as being a good thing, and then trying to understand that view and translating it into the public economics language may be a good idea. Now, another thing which is reasonably obvious when you think about absolute mobility, but I think needs to be taken very seriously, is the issue of was the real income, the income adjusted for prices that you compare across generations, is the welfare content in some reasonable sense comparable of those things? And of course, this is the kind of stuff that economists have been grappling with for a very long time and have very good answers to. But it does bring in very difficult problems of income distribution measurement, including the valuation of public services, the distribution of public services to those people, direct and indirect taxation and issues of this sort. So I in fact think if we take these things very seriously, it may be that the US, for instance, might look even more bleak than it does, and so on. But there are lots of things we need to take very seriously, especially if we do this in a cross-national context, before we can say anything much more interesting. But possibly I have two very last things to say, and one of them is, I think Alan's and Larry Katz's work is really interesting because it gets back to something I was trying to think about a little bit yesterday, which is that mobility and inequality aren't really all that different. So the risk factors that are associated with having low income in a cross-section are very similar to the risk factors associated with having persistently low income. They're very similar to the risk factors associated with not being mobile and so on. So it really is about dimension. The time dimension, once you start pushing it, things don't necessarily look all that different. So inequality and mobility aren't really different species of study, but they're all about the study of inequality in economic resources. And the very final thing, which I think it would be nice to take a Piketty's view of some of these issues. And in particular, I was struck reading Piketty about in the first third of the book where he discussed about accumulation in a low growth versus a high growth world. And I also think that so the mobility issue comes back to differences of inequality in high growth and low growth worlds. There's much more to it than just that, but it in a sense I think that perspective may provide us with lots of insights of the kinds, I think, which are abundant in Alan's and Larry's work. Okay, thanks.